Give us Grandma's $3.5 million, or we'll destroy your nursing career.
Sign over the inheritance and the complaint disappears.
Perfect. You just gave me the evidence I needed.
When my grandmother died, I thought the hardest part would be learning how to doubt the woman who had believed in me more than anyone else. I was wrong. The real nightmare began when my parents learned what Grandma had left me. $3.5 million. But the inheritance was never simply about money. It became the match that exposed years of resentment, entitlement, manipulation, and a family secret my parents had assumed would remain buried forever. I had spent most of my adult life working as a nurse. It wasn't glamorous. There were 12-hour shifts that turned into 14. Holidays spent under fluorescent hospital lights, aching feet, frightened families, and patients whose names stayed with me long after they went home. Nursing was more than my paycheck. It was the one part of my life I had built entirely for myself. My parents had never understood that. Growing up, everything in our family came with strings attached. Praise was given when I was useful. Affection disappeared when I disagreed. My mother could turn a family dinner into an interrogation with a single question, while my father had perfected the art of making demands sound like obligations. Grandma was different. She noticed things. She noticed when my parents dismissed my accomplishments. She noticed when they expected me to solve their problems simply because I was the responsible child. And when I chose nursing instead of the career my parents wanted for me, Grandma was the person who said, "Build a life that belongs to you." Those words became my compass. Over the years, Grandma and I became close. I helped with groceries, appointments, medication lists, and the ordinary things that become harder with age. But she never treated my help as something she was entitled to. She thanked me. She asked about my work. She remembered the names of patients I had mentioned weeks earlier. Most importantly, she never confused love with ownership. My parents did. After Grandma passed away, the family gathered for the reading of her estate documents. I expected sentimental possessions, perhaps some jewelry, photographs, or a small savings account. Instead, the attorney explained that Grandma had placed the bulk of her estate, approximately $3.5 million, in a trust for me. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then my mother asked the attorney to repeat himself. My father stared at me, as if I had stolen something directly from his hands. They had received other property and personal items, but nowhere near the amount they expected. Grandma had made her intentions clear. The money was mine. On the drive home, my phone began ringing. First my mother, then my father, then my mother again. By that evening, the messages had changed from shock to accusation. They said Grandma couldn't possibly have understood what she was signing. They suggested I had influenced her, because I was a nurse and had been around her medications. My mother demanded that I do the right thing and divide the inheritance. I refused. That was the moment everything changed. At first, they tried guilt. They reminded me of everything they had supposedly sacrificed while raising me. My father talked about family loyalty. My mother said keeping the inheritance would destroy our relationship. I told them Grandma had made her own decision. Then they tried bargaining. They proposed percentages. Half for them, half for me. Then they suggested I could keep $1 million and give them the rest. They spoke about the money as if it were already theirs, and I was merely refusing to transfer it. Again, I said no. Then came the threat. My mother told me that if I insisted on stealing their inheritance, they would make sure I regretted it. I thought it was anger talking. A few weeks later, I received a notice from the state nursing board. A formal complaint had been filed against me. I remember reading the letter twice because the words did not seem real. The allegations were serious. I was accused of professional misconduct involving medication handling, patient boundaries, and dishonesty. Any one of those accusations could damage a nurse's career. Together, they could destroy it. My stomach dropped. I immediately contacted my supervisor and an attorney experienced in professional licensing cases. Hospital administration placed the matter under review. Although a complaint was not the same as proof, I suddenly found myself defending the reputation I had spent years building. Then I learned who had made the report. My parents. They had crossed a line I never imagined even they would cross. The complaint suggested that my access to medical knowledge had allowed me to manipulate Grandma while she was vulnerable. It implied that I had misused my professional position and possibly interfered with her medication or decision-making. The accusations were carefully worded to sound alarming. But there was one problem. They weren't true. And unlike my parents, Grandma had planned ahead. My attorney began collecting records. We obtained employment evaluations, medication administration documentation, hospital policies, witness statements, and records showing that I had never been Grandma's treating nurse. Her physicians managed her medical care independently. My work record was clean. No disciplinary history. No suspicious medication discrepancies. No patient complaints matching what my parents claimed. Still, the investigation was terrifying. Every time my phone rang, I wondered whether it was the board. Every shift felt different. I became hyper-aware of every chart entry and every medication scan. I worried that coworkers would look at me differently if they heard about the allegations. For my parents, however, the complaint was leverage. My mother sent a message saying the whole mess could disappear if I agreed to settle the inheritance dispute. That message changed everything. Until then, they could pretend the complaint was motivated by genuine concern. And now there was evidence connecting their accusations to the money. I saved the message. Then another arrived. My father wrote that losing part of the inheritance was better than losing my nursing license. I saved that too. My attorney's reaction was immediate. Don't respond, he told me. Let them keep talking. So I did. The more I remained silent, the more reckless my parents became. They sent emails accusing me of tearing the family apart. They referenced the board complaint while demanding money. My mother even suggested that if I transferred a large portion of the inheritance, they would clarify to investigators that perhaps they had misunderstood certain events. Every message became another piece of evidence. Meanwhile, my grandmother's estate attorney uncovered something even more important. Months before her death, Grandma had anticipated a challenge. She had undergone an independent competency evaluation before finalizing her estate plan. The physician's report stated that she understood her assets, and knew who her relatives were, and clearly understood how she wanted her estate distributed. There was more. Grandma had also written a letter explaining her decision. She described a long history of financial pressure from my parents. She wrote that she loved them, but did not trust them to respect her wishes. She specifically stated that I had never asked her for money, and had never pressured her about the estate. Reading that letter broke my heart. Grandma had known there would be a fight. She had tried to protect me even after she was gone. My parents, meanwhile, filed a challenge against the estate. Their argument was predictable. Grandma had supposedly lacked capacity, and I had allegedly exercised undue influence. But their case began falling apart almost immediately. The competency evaluation contradicted them. Her attorney contradicted them. Her physician contradicted them. Friends who had seen Grandma regularly described her as sharp, opinionated, and perfectly capable of making decisions. Financial records also showed something my parents did not want discussed. Grandma had given them substantial help over the years. Loans, bills paid on their behalf, money that was never repaid. Her decision to leave the largest portion to me had not come out of nowhere. It was the final chapter of a pattern only she fully understood. Then the nursing board investigation reached its critical stage. My attorney submitted the documentation showing the financial dispute, and my parents' messages linking their complaint to the inheritance. We provided evidence that the allegations lacked factual support. Investigators interviewed relevant witnesses. My employer confirmed my professional history. Grandma's healthcare providers confirmed that I had not controlled her treatment. The picture became increasingly clear. My parents had tried to turn a professional licensing system into a weapon in a private financial dispute. Eventually, the complaint against me was dismissed. I still remember the moment my attorney told me. For months I had carried an invisible weight into every hospital corridor. I had imagined losing the career I loved because two people who were supposed to be my family wanted money that wasn't theirs. And suddenly, that weight was gone. My license remained intact. My professional record survived, but the story wasn't over. The dismissal strengthened our position in the inheritance dispute. My parents had claimed they were protecting a vulnerable elderly woman, yet their own messages suggested something very different. They had effectively tied their accusations to demands for money. Their credibility collapsed. Faced with the medical evaluation, Grandma's written statement, witness testimony, and their own communications, my parents' challenge failed. The trust remained valid. The $3.5 million was mine. When everything was finally settled, my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I almost answered. Instead, I let it go to voicemail. Her message wasn't an apology. She said we had all made mistakes. She said money shouldn't come between family. She said she hoped I would eventually remember who had raised me. That was when I finally understood something Grandma had been trying to teach me for years. Money hadn't destroyed our family. It had revealed it. The inheritance didn't turn my parents into different people. It simply gave them something valuable enough to stop hiding who they were. They had been willing to jeopardize my livelihood, my reputation, and the career I had spent years building, because they believed they deserved Grandma's money more than I did. I didn't call back. Instead, I began deciding what I wanted the inheritance to mean. I paid off my debts. I created a conservative investment plan with professional advice. I established an emergency fund large enough that I would never again feel trapped by someone else's financial pressure. But I kept working. People were surprised by that. Why keep doing 12-hour shifts if you're a millionaire? Someone asked me. Because Grandma hadn't left me money so I could stop being myself. She had left it so nobody could control me. Nursing still mattered to me. My patients still mattered. The inheritance gave me choices, not a new identity. Eventually, I reduced my hours and began helping fund scholarships for nursing students who were struggling financially. It felt right to turn part of Grandma's gift into opportunities for people trying to build independent lives of their own. I also went to therapy, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to understand how years of manipulation had shaped my reactions. I learned that boundaries weren't punishment. Distance wasn't cruelty. And forgiveness, if it ever came, did not require reopening the door. My parents occasionally tried reaching me through relatives. Some family members urged me to reconcile. They're still your parents, they said. I stopped arguing with that sentence. Yes, I would answer. And I'm still their daughter. That's why what they did mattered so much. Family titles don't erase choices. A parent can love a child and still harm them. A child can care about a parent and still decide that contact is unsafe or destructive. Months later, I visited Grandma's grave. I brought the flowers she always liked and sat there longer than I expected. For the first time since her death, I wasn't thinking about lawyers, investigators, board complaints, trusts, or money. I was thinking about her kitchen. Her laugh, the way she would push a plate toward me whenever she thought I hadn't eaten enough, and those words she had given me years earlier: build a life that belongs to you. I finally had. The 3.5 million mattered, of course. Pretending otherwise would be ridiculous. It gave me security most people never receive. But Grandma's real inheritance was something else. She had given me permission to trust my own judgment. My parents had tried to use fear to force me back into the role they preferred: obedient, guilty, useful, and easy to control. For a while, the nursing board complaint almost worked. I was frightened. I questioned myself. I wondered whether refusing their demands had somehow made me responsible for the chaos. But facts have a way of surviving manipulation. My record showed the truth. Grandma's documents showed the truth. And eventually, my parents' own words showed the truth. They wanted the money. They thought threatening my career would make me surrender it. They were wrong. Today, when I walk into the hospital and clip my badge onto my scrubs, I sometimes think about how close they came to taking that part of my life away. Then I remember that they didn't. My career survived. Grandma's wishes survived. And I survived the moment when family loyalty was used as a weapon against me. The experience taught me that an inheritance can be much more than property. Sometimes it is the final boundary someone draws on your behalf. A grandma drew mine with extraordinary care. My parents tried to erase it. Instead, they made it permanent. And if there is one lesson I carried out of the entire ordeal, it is this: when people demand that you sacrifice your future to prove you love them, they aren't asking for love. They're asking for control. Grandma knew the difference. Now I do too.